Now, in the presence of oxygen, that pyruvate molecule, in a process we'll describe shortly, will be taken into the mitochondrion. And on the way in, it's actually going to lose one of the three carbons. But we'll talk about that later. But that's in the presence of oxygen. When oxygen is not present, we have to go by another route. And pyruvate has to be further broken down. And the way it is broken down is in a process called fermentation. And fermentation also occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, just like glycolysis does. And I guarantee you that somewhere on the final exam, you will be asked to know where all these processes occur. So glycolysis and fermentation both occur in the cytoplasm. Now, fermentation occurs by two major routes and some minor routes. We're going to talk about the two major routes. One of the major routes occurs in plants, at least most plants, and many microorganisms. The other process occurs in animals and some microorganisms. We'll talk first about the one that happens in plants, and that is alcoholic fermentation. It's called alcoholic fermentation because one of the products is alcohol, and as you may know, this is economically important. This is where Thursday nights in Millersville come from. This is where you make alcohol. Okay, now what happens here is that notice the reduced NAD that we made up above in glycolysis is used up here. And it basically donates electrons to pyruvate. And when it does that, you've regenerated oxidized NAD. And that's important because if all the NAD, which is present in finite amounts in the cell, if all the NAD is tied up in the reduced form, glycolysis will stop. And if it stops, you can't make ATP. And if you make ATP, that can't make ATP, you die. So fermentation is done to keep these organisms making ATP when oxygen isn't present, so they can make even more ATP. So this is a stopgap measure. If you can't make ATP with oxygen, you have to make it by glycolysis and fermentation. And the result is you need that oxidized NAD to keep things running. Turns out that oxidized NAD is also produced during the mitochondrial phase of respiration, like Krebs cycle and electron transport. But we don't have that going here because there's no oxygen. So the reduced NAD adds electrons to pyruvate, regenerating oxidized NAD, which can go up above and keep glycolysis running. And when these electrons are added, the 3-carbon pyruvate breaks down into a 2-carbon molecule and a 1-carbon molecule. And that is the 2-carbon molecule is alcohol, the 1-carbon molecule is CO2, which of course goes off as CO2. You exhale it. The 2-carbon molecule alcohol is used in actually baking and in making beer. Yeast make alcohol when they are in bread, and the result is that alcohol bakes off during baking, and you can smell it, and that's one of the nice smells that comes from bread. So here, in plants and many microorganisms like yeasts, we make alcohol in the absence of oxygen. That is fermentation, alcoholic fermentation. Now, we'll look at fermentation in animals like ourselves, and again, also in some microorganisms. This is also economically important. This is where things like cheese and yogurt come from this particular fermentation process. Okay, once again, you start with pyruvate, which is the end product of glycolysis. And once again, in comes NAD and adds electrons to pyruvate, again regenerating NAD in its oxidized form, again to keep glycolysis going. And when it does that, instead of getting a 2-carbon molecule and a 1-carbon molecule, you get a 3-carbon molecule. This 3-carbon molecule is called lactic acid or lactate. And lactic acid is what helps us make cheese and yogurt. Now, it is also the reason that when you exercise a muscle that you haven't exercised for a while, you feel that pain a day or so later. The reason for this is as follows. Muscles that have been exercised a lot increase their blood flow so they can bring more oxygen to those muscles. And what will happen is those muscles can then run aerobically in the presence of oxygen longer than a muscle that hasn't been exercised and doesn't have that extra blood flow to it. So what you do is you exercise an unexercised muscle, and it is forced to run anaerobically for a longer period of time, and it builds up lactic acid. Now, as you can tell from the name, lactic acid is acidic, and consequently it lowers the pH of the muscle, and this is what causes the pain some day or two after you exercise this muscle. And what will happen is blood flow will eventually take away that lactic acid, take it to the liver where it will be remetabolized, and you'll get more energy from it at that point, but it takes time for that to happen, and that's why you feel pain. So that's why they say no pain, no gain. Now, when I was in high school, about the only thing on the physical fitness test that I could pass was doing 100 sit-ups. And that was because doing sit-ups is simply a matter of willpower. You just keep going until you can't stop. And of course, I hadn't done 100 sit-ups since the last time I did them 6 months earlier. So what would happen here is I would exercise those muscles whose blood flow had been decreased. And for a couple days afterwards, my stomach muscles would hurt. And of course, what people would do when they knew that this had happened to you was they'd try to make you laugh, because then you'd laugh and it would hurt at the same time. So that pain that you feel in muscles you haven't exercised for a while is due to the lactic acid lowering the pH of that muscle, and that's what causes the pain. Okay, we've talked about what happens in the absence of oxygen. You have fermentation, where in the case of plants you can make alcohol and CO2. Again, that adds up to 3 carbons of pyruvate. And then in animals and some other microorganisms, you make lactic acid, and that ends up, that's 3 carbons, so that you can account for the 3 carbons of pyruvate. In the presence of oxygen, however, pyruvate goes into the Krebs cycle, or the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the TCA cycle, and then you get all those products that you see down there coming off, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about the Krebs cycle. But right now, you need, and by the way, the Krebs cycle occurs inside the mitochondrion, specifically in the mitochondrial matrix. Okay? Electron transport, as we're going to see, occurs in the membranes, the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, the cristae membranes. That's where electron transport occurs. And again, you're going to need to know where all these processes occur, because I'm mean and I will ask that question. Now, this slide is a summary slide for fermentation. It shows you just an overall sequence of where you start with fermentation at the head of glycolysis and where you end up after doing glycolysis followed by fermentation. And in animals, you get lactic acid, and in plants, you get ethanol and CO2. And this is just an overall schematic slide just to see as a summary of that process, so you should look at it and make sure you understand what's going on. This is a closer view of fermentation that makes lactic acid fermentation. So take a close look at that, and I'm going to follow it with a slide that shows some of the things that are made with lactic acid fermentation. As promised, here is a slide that shows some products of lactic acid fermentation: pickles, sauerkraut, and cheese. Yogurt should be on there too. And this is a close-up slide of alcoholic fermentation, and I will follow that up with a slide similar to the previous one that I showed. And here is a slide showing you alcoholic fermentation at work in an establishment that is making alcoholic beverages.